Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome to this special edition of Corporate Citizenship Watch, a Conference Board webcast series brought to you by the Conference Board ESG Center. I'm Jeff Hoffman, Institute Leader of Corporate Citizenship and Philanthropy of the Conference Board ESG Center. The Conference Board is the world's leading independent nonprofit think tank dedicated to serving business and society for well over a century. At the ESG Center, we focus on the areas of corporate governance, sustainability, and corporate citizenship. Today's webcast, providing a roadmap for disaster response, CAF America's Global Relief Navigator, is made possible by the generous support of our sponsor, CAF America. According to a new report published last month by the Global Commission on Economics of Water, for the first time in human history, fueling a growing water disaster that will wreak havoc on economies, food production, and lives. A growing water disaster. I've never really heard it framed that way before. Sadly, in just the last 6 weeks, we have seen Hurricane Helene and Milton in the United States, Typhoon Kongray, the most powerful storm to hit Taiwan, in nearly 3 decades, in the torrential rains resulting flooding in Valencia, Spain. These are just a few of the recent disasters that we are seeing that are stronger and certainly more frequent. We have 2 great speakers today. We have RAQUEL WEINTRAUB, who's Chief Operating Officer of CADENA Foundation, and Brooks Reed, who's Vice President of Thought Leadership and Philanthropy at CAF America. It's a pleasure to have you all here with us today, and some of the key issues that Brooks and RAQUEL are going to be talking with us about are a general framing through which companies can approach disaster and crisis response, challenges and principles for funding to borrow or learn from when planning their humanitarian response strategies, a great case study of an organization currently responding to many humanitarian emergencies, and ways in which companies can make a direct impact partnering with intermediaries in a specific program by CAF America that allows you to give more. But first, I want to jump into some housekeeping issues. If you're looking at your screen, which I assume you are, first at the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets that you can use to interact with this webcast. We welcome audience participation in today's session. You can ask questions in the Q&A widget. We will work them into the conversation as time permits. The slide deck with additional resources is available on that available resources widget at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And then you can share this program with your colleagues after the fact, as it will be viewable on demand in the next couple of days. So now let's get started. RAQUEL and Brooks have a deep understanding of philanthropy and how to deploy it in a crisis. RAQUEL, as mentioned, is the Chief Operating Officer of CADENA. CADENA is an NGO based in Mexico that works to alleviate human suffering. Through prevention, immediate response, and direct assistance, CADENA works to reduce the vulnerability of people facing disasters and crises. RAQUEL has been part of CADENA since 2005, where she has partnered in, led, and created various educational programs, operations, and humanitarian interventions. She has experience as a consultant in social responsibility, sustainability, humanitarian work, and strategic planning in both the private and nonprofit sectors. Brooks is Vice President of Thought Leadership and Philanthropy for CAF America, and CAF America is part of CAF, an international philanthropic organization that exists to advance progress in society towards a fair and sustainable future for all. In the U.S., CAF partners with individuals, foundations, and corporations to facilitate grant-making programs, allowing any funder to provide and give more and more impactfully while investing in more resilient social organizations. Brooks has been with CAF America since 2017, and among many other areas oversees the organization's disaster response programming. With that, Brooks, take it away.
Thank you, Jeff, and good morning, everyone. I'm having, I will say, some slight buffering issues. So if you see any blips, definitely Jeff and the conference board team let me know. It's great to be here today, and it's such a pleasure to be able to speak to you all around this really important topic. I'm going to start off with just going through a roadmap of what Raquel and I are going to be covering today. And I do want to start off by thanking Jeff and the conference board team for, one, such a warm introduction, but then two, the ability to work with them and the opportunity to start to tell some of this story. It is such a pleasure and an opportunity to speak directly to corporations about this. As Jeff mentioned, CAF America is a platform for companies like yourselves to give anywhere internationally. And a big part of our work, especially since 2020, has been focused on enabling companies and donors of all types to be able to give to locally incorporated organizations all around the world. So we are really excited to be able to share a bit about our approach, to share a bit about Raquel's approach and the approach that CADENA has taken as a really good example of the types of organizations that we love to work with on a day-to-day basis, but then also to provide some frameworks that you can all use to be able to frame some of the work that you're doing. So we're going to start off talking about basically why disaster philanthropy, why now, why is it so important, and what's the purpose that we have in speaking about it to you all. We'll talk a little bit about the principles for effective emergency response and talk about how CADENA in particular has been able to implement many of those in their work. Talk a bit about the ongoing work that Raquel is involved in right now. And then thinking about how that backs into challenges that funders face around funding disasters effectively and engaging with communities to increase their resilience and their ability to sustain themselves through these times of need. And then as the title of this webinar implies, we're also going to be sharing a bit about a new program CAF America has and contextualize that in the framework of the challenges and the principles that we're talking about today. And hopefully give you all some ideas about how to work with intermediaries like us to take some of the lessons that we're sharing here and implementing them in your day-to-day work. So starting off, I do want to spend some time to just talk about the need for disaster philanthropy. And when we think about why this topic and why now, we really have to be looking at the last year of natural disasters and understand that we're in, and I hate to say this, it is so cliche, but we are in somewhat of an unprecedented time for climate-related disasters. In many ways, we're seeing that impacting here in the US. I think one of the facts that sticks with me over the last few months is that as of now, the country most impacted by natural disasters in the whole world is the United States. But at the same time, every country around the world is seeing some sort of impact from our changing climate, from the increasing conflict and instability that's happening in many areas around the world, and generally the crises and humanitarian emergencies that we're seeing emerge. And what that is doing is driving a lot of need and straining a lot of the resources that organizations that support those humanitarian needs are able to deploy. So I do want to start off with some quick polling. And I'll be very quick with this, but what we want to do, and Raquel and I were talking around how we want to start this, and we really want to see what everyone's awareness of disasters in 2024 is from around the world. So we're going to put out a few examples, and there's going to be the same responses in terms of what disaster is it that happened there. Some of them will be easier than others, but we're going to go quickly through 4 examples, and I'll be able to share the correct answer as we move through them. So I'm going to go to the first poll question right now. So in 2024, what natural disaster impacted the city of Talisay on the island of Cebu in the Philippines? If you want to just click on those responses in the slide, that will register your response there. I'm going to give it a few seconds to see if everyone can. Right, we're seeing some submissions come in. We're going to give it a few more seconds to try and get some of those responses up. Yeah, what type of disaster would hit in the Philippines? And while I can't give out any prizes for this, there's no, there's no grading for the wrong answer. So go ahead and select one. Got to get a few more selections in there. Again, you can just click directly on the letter that you think corresponds with the right answer. All right, let's see what we got. We have landslides, flooding, and cyclones tied as the most popular answer, and then drought and wildfire is the least popular. The correct answer is that there were landslides in Talisay that resulted in destruction of a lot of buildings and a displacement of many people in the region. It was a result of heavy rains, however, not as the specific disaster that we saw there. The next is what type of natural disaster had a large impact across countries in East Africa? And this might be a little bit more simple, but really interested to see what everyone remembers from 2024, the news cycle. Was it landslides, flooding, drought or wildfires, or a cyclone? And when we say East Africa, to clarify, we do mean the Horn of Africa. So Kenya, Somalia, Tanzania, those types of countries, Ethiopia. We'll give it a few more seconds. Right, so here we are at drought wildfires as the most popular answer. While there were issues with rainfall in Africa, parts of Africa this year, the largest issue that we saw specifically in countries like Kenya and Somalia was actually with flooding that was associated with the monsoon season this year. So, I think drought and wildfires is a really smart answer, but also we saw a lot of awareness. We did not see a lot of awareness being attributed to the flooding that happened, which caused many rivers to overflow in East Africa in 2024. And a kind of a symbol of the changing climate that we've been looking at. This is not meant to be a trick question, but there are more than one right answers here. So what type of natural disaster struck communities in Brazil this year? And again, for anyone who's joining new, you can click directly on the answer that you'd like to submit, and we'll be able to show just a quick distribution there as well. And here I'll give a bit of a cue. Think about news that you heard coming out of the Amazon rainforest this year. And we'll give it a few more seconds to get some more submissions in there. Just click on one of the options that you think is the right one. Got about 4 more seconds. All right. So here we had flooding as our most popular. That is a correct answer. We also saw a drought in the Amazon that affected Brazilian communities, one of the most serious droughts in the Amazon rainforest's history, and the lack of rainfall there contributing to drops in water levels throughout the Amazon River basin, followed by intense flooding and rainfall that have hit communities in somewhat of a double punch. And then quickly going to our last one, what type of natural disaster impacted countries across the Persian Gulf? Now, this might, I remember some of the news that came out of the Persian Gulf region this year around something that might be a bit surprising. And this is the last question, I promise, but if we can try and get some responses in there, that'd be really great. Again, for anyone who has just joined us, we're just doing some polling to see about awareness of different natural disasters that happened in regions outside of the US around the world this year. So if you want to directly click on the option for what you think the correct answer is, we just want to see kind of how much our crew today is aware of what's been going on this year. I'm just going to wait a few seconds to see if everyone can get that, get those responses in, and then we'll see what everyone says. And again, just click directly on one of the letters and it will record your vote. All right. All right, we're going to move on in about 3 seconds. So I see some answers still coming in here as well. Awesome. So we have a pretty even distribution here. And believe it or not, what we saw was flooding. So if you think about the pictures we saw coming out of Dubai in that area earlier this year, there was actually intense rainfall across especially the Gulf states that they were not accustomed to, which caused different types of crises than they're used to, which is probably more attributed to heat and heat waves. The reason why we went through this, and I think it's really interesting to see everyone's responses here, is just to underline that it's not just that the U.S. is going through a period of intense weather, but the whole world is experiencing this. And in terms of thinking about why we're choosing to talk about this now and why we, CAF America, have chosen to focus on this topic as an organization that is not primarily a disaster response organization, it's really important for us to think about the case for having this discussion, because there's many different issue areas that we can be talking about. But as people who work in philanthropy, I think that there's a really strong narrative a really strong case for putting resources into effective disaster response, and for funders and companies who are looking to do this in an intentional, impactful way. That's important to understand the scale of the problem that we're looking at. So when we look at, or when we think about why disaster philanthropy, as we just talked about, climate change is making these disasters worse and more frequent. Repeated humanitarian emergencies are actually straining the system. So there is a substantial system that's set up to help people in situations where they face disasters and crises. But that system is being deployed more and more, and the resources that go into that system are becoming very strained. And then definitely since the COVID pandemic, there's been a term that's been applied to this elevated level of crisis and emergency that some people call the polycrisis, which means that we're in a general climate, quote unquote, polycrisis, in which different things are happening in such a rapid succession that you can't really distinguish one from the other when it comes to a response strategy. And so you see many people across the humanitarian space and the philanthropy space pivoting to a systems change approach rather than a response approach in particular. And just to give an extension of the types of disasters that we're tracking, in 2024, all of those natural disasters that we just had polls about happened. But remember, there were global conflicts in Ukraine and Palestine and around the world that escalated in 2024. Thinking about Sudan and the civil war that's escalated there. Temperatures have skyrocketed, meaning that not only are we looking at events related to climate change, but we're looking at general health impacts of the changing climate and temperature. That's also driving things like food insecurity. Droughts lead to crop failure, which leads to famine. And that's something that the international system's also responding to. And then when we think about the other side of that, rain and floods, flooding has been a huge, unfortunately, a huge theme of the last half of 2024. And RAQUEL will talk a bit later about what that has looked like in Spain and what the work that CADENA has been doing. But what we've seen is that just as we've seen extensive flooding here in the US, communities around the world are seeing this as well. And as an international grant-making organization, we really want to stress how important it is to think not only of people here in the US, but if we have a global mindset for our philanthropic giving, to be elevating the stories of those in other countries that have been impacted by the same pattern of natural disaster. So in terms of contextualizing our work within this general framework of needs, I just want to go into a little bit how we talk about our work and why it's necessary. So the general narrative that we work within at CAF America is really community oriented. And in that sense, we see disasters causing community needs to spike. When that need expands, and that can be because structures have been impacted, because systems have been disrupted, because prices of food and things like that have been changed, when general infrastructure has been impacted, more money is needed to provide the same level of care to people. But the systems that are there in place to be able to provide that can't cope with the amount of need that's there. Think about a hospital during a pandemic. They can meet the needs from a normal load of people coming in with ailments or with injuries, but as you start to flood that hospital with COVID patients, for example, there's a scaling problem that happens when humanitarian emergencies are in play that goes above and beyond what government or a social service network would be able to provide. At that same time, the funding streams that support that scale really struggle to scale. And then especially when we're looking internationally, what we see is that funders in places that have lots of money, like the United States, look at organizations or communities in countries that are not in the United States, and they don't know how to get money from point A to point B. And within that context, we see our work is connecting all of these needs together, connecting all these challenges together with simple solutions that allow funders to be proactive about being able to support charities' ability to scale their support, and then being able to deploy funding when it makes sense. And then supporting that, just want to share a few principles about our approach, and I'm going to be doing a little bit more frame setting before I hand it over to RAQUEL, but just to get into a bit of how CAF America approaches this. We really see our primary stakeholders, or the people that we serve here, as the people who are in the communities impacted by disasters. We try to work with organizations that are supporting them as proxies for them, and as the best instrument for us to provide support to them. And we think that organizations that work closely with communities through their strategies or how they're led or owned are for us the most credible partners, and the partners that are farthest from most of the funding in global north countries like the US, especially when we think about charities working in other countries. And then we also think that, as we engage in this, part of the reason why we're having this conversation, because we believe that funders across the board, not just companies, but any type of donor who wants to support humanitarian response, should really be thinking about that community approach when they're strategizing around disaster response funding and grant making. I want to also acknowledge that this is a dynamic that's much easier here in the US. There's a lot of very good organizations that are doing very locally targeted response, relief, and reconstruction around issues like Hurricane Helene recently, but if you look farther back in the past, Hurricane Harvey, and the different storms that have hit the South in the last few years, but then also the wildfire response and recovery. When we look internationally, there's a lot of other challenges that funders face. So thinking about specific challenges specific to international funding, as we sit between funders here in the US and charities in other countries, these are three main challenges that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. The first is finding partners here in the US is easy because there's a list of 501c3 exempt organizations that you would know, even if you haven't done your program due diligence for them, that they are, you can expect them to be a well-governed organization that are following the rules set out by the IRS, and that the work that they're doing, especially if you're working with a corporate foundation, would be considered exempt or charitable under the regulatory framework here in the US. While this is a very simple thing to check for here, when you look at other countries, that level of basic oversight is not there. So it puts the burden of due diligence very solely on the funder to be able to find things around those partners that allow you to justify the grant. A lot of countries have rules and regulations around charities receiving money that require them to spend more time in red tape to be able to get money in situations where rapid funding is necessary or larger funding is necessary. This makes it really difficult to get money directly into bank accounts when you need it. And then lastly, while there's many ways to onboard these partners and find these partners, especially when emergencies are actively happening, they will not be picking the phone up to fill out an application. They will need to be deploying their resources and spending time, especially with local organizations, spending time to actually supporting the communities that they serve. You may find that there are opportunities to give, but if we think about the ways in which we want to be thoughtfully bringing ourselves to the table here, making first contact with an organization the day after something happens is not the most strategic, and it might not lead to a timely and effective response. And Raquel might be able to say a bit more about that as I pass it off to her. But I think the main piece here is, as I wrap up this first section, is remember there are things happening all around the world all the time that we might not be aware of, but that we still are able to fund and we think should be on our agenda. And then secondly, if you wait until one of those disasters comes up in front of your face, it's going to be too late to put together a response strategy that's truly impactful and serves the people that you want. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Raquel.
If I may interrupt, before we move over to Raquel, we have a question that has been asked. Do you have insights on how companies respond to support employees? Do these intersect in some way?
Yes. So there's many ways in which a company can support their employees in the US and internationally. I think the primary way that I know of that we support is through an employee disaster and hardship relief program, which is a specific type of fund that can be sponsored by a public charity. There are a few providers that come to mind here, the Employee Assistance Foundation, E4E Relief, that allow employers to provide direct cash grants to employees that are impacted by a disaster that's declared a disaster, I believe, by the State Department, and that includes disasters here in the US. And so there's direct cash assistance programs that that can be set up for those employees. I think that there's a whole entirely other separate conversation to be had around how to engage employees in this work. And I think that especially if you have a global employee base, being able to see disasters that are happening in communities that they're seeing where they're present in, and then being able to respond to those effectively or preemptively create a program that shows care for that community is a really good way of engaging those employees, showing them that the company cares. At the same time, the community is great, but in many cases, we know that companies' primary stakeholders can be those employees. So having that paired with an employee assistance program can also be a really good approach. So those are two strategies that come to mind for me.
We will pop a report in the chat that we have on how to help employees during a time of disaster when they are the ones that were impacted. So with that, back to you, Brooks.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I'm actually now going to pass it over to RAQUEL to talk a bit about her work at CADENA.
Thank you, Brooks. So we saw in the pool how we know about the disasters around the world, and we see that we don't know what is happening, and if the disaster isn't covered by the media, on Facebook, in all the news, we don't know what is happening. And the money doesn't go to these disasters, and we have seen it as an NGO. So there isn't real that the money isn't there. Is in 2022, in the world, in the humanitarian world, the money is decreasing. We have seen this a lot, but the money is out there. We have seen that if you see how much money is in the bubblegum industry, you will see that there is money. If you see how much money is going into wars, you will see that there is money. But the money isn't coming to the humanitarian world, and this doesn't work with the needs that we have. Like this year, not the half of the needs of the humanitarian world are getting met. So we can see a little bit here. CADENA has been working from 20 years. We have now 11 offices around the world. We have been in more than 31 countries, and we have helped more than 4 million people. And this is not a number, but in each of these numbers, we have a story. I have been in many places around the world in the field, and I have seen many disasters, and really you find amazing stories in the field. And all this can happen thanks to the donors that gave us the resources to go there. But if we, as Brooke said, if we have the resources just in the moment that we are going to the field, it's very difficult. But because the disaster is striking, we have to go to the field. We don't know how much money we have to get this response, so we have to have plans before going to the field. And I want to show you a little bit of this. This is the cluster approach. I don't know if you have seen it before, of the OCHA. That is the Office of the Humanitarian Affairs that manage all the disasters. And we can see here all the phases of the disasters. And in all these phases, we mostly and we mostly see in the news the part of the disasters. We see the disaster, the Turkey earthquake was in the news, we saw that, and we sent the rescue teams. But we can do many things before. So we have the prevention, the mitigation, the preparedness. And if we work through these areas, the disaster will be less. And if you invest $1 in prevention, you can not invest $17 in the disaster. So this is only money. And if we talk about human suffering, it's a lot more. So we can see all these phases of the disasters. And it's very important for us to see that if we start working with companies in the prevention, mitigation, or preparedness, it's easier for us to jump in the disaster. We will have to jump in the disasters because the climate is getting crazy, and many times we don't know what will happen, like we are seeing in Valencia. This is the first time for them in many years that they flood. Or also we saw this at the beginning of the year in Brazil. I was in Brazil 3 weeks, and they told me in 100 years, this hadn't happened in this area. We weren't prepared. We didn't expect this to come, so we can work with them. But if we work with companies and we have funds with companies before the disasters, it will be easier because we know that you need all the things. You need the documents, you need the contract, you need the compliance, you need the due diligence. But in the time of the disaster, the time is gold. So if we haven't worked together earlier, it's very difficult. And also you can see in this cluster approach that we have different areas that we can support. In the case of CADENA, we are a multi-cluster approach organization, so we work in almost all the clusters, and depending on the needs that we see, not only the visible needs as it can be shelter or wash, that is water and sanitation, also the invisible needs that can be mental health or can be gender-based violence, we work in when we go to the disaster zones. And also we have seen this in Valencia. We just sent a team a couple of days ago there because we have worked in the area so much time, and in Europe because of the Poland crisis of refugees because of the Ukraine war. So we are working with local NGOs there, and we saw that the people isn't prepared, that they don't know what to do, and there is so many confusion. So we sent a team over there, and we are working there right now. And this is a little bit about us, Brooks. I don't know if you have any question.
Yeah, definitely. I think it would be really interesting if you could share a bit about how your fundraising works, right? And how that pattern can, how you enter this type of deployment and how you then use that to deploy resources, or how you prepare resources beforehand. I know when we've been speaking about this, you mentioned having funds on hand to be able to spend. If you could share a bit about how CADENA prepares and how you build your ability to deploy beforehand, that would be really helpful, I think.
Yes, we have many types of fundings, but always we need money. We have the funding of the people, the crowdfunding, and when a disaster hits and it's in the media, it's easier, the people are aware, the people donate. So we have that type of response, but we can fund all the disasters with this type of crowdfunding. As you can see, many times we are not aware, and if we are not aware, the people don't donate. Also, we have been working with different organizations like it's Start Network. Start Network is an organization based in the UK. They have a model that you make a due diligence before, and you have to have many things with there, but you have the due diligence and you can arise alerts, and you said okay, there are floods in Brazil, the media isn't covering them, and we need you to donate to this. So you raise an alert, the people vote, the other NGOs vote if the alert can pass, and if the alert passes, you can propose a project. You propose a project and you can receive funding with some special adjustments and things that you have to present, but the money is in your account in 72 hours. So this is very amazing for us as an NGO, because in 72 hours from the disaster start, we know if we have the resources to deploy, we have the resources to be there more time. So many times we can go to the disaster with the crowdfunding, or with some individual donor, but we can't spend more than 3 or 4 days or a week in the disaster if we have not ensured some donors to the response. But we have seen the needs. And also we work with companies. We create this model inside of CADENA as a Start Network model, but with some enterprises. What we do is that we work with funding. So they give us a funding in a year. They told okay, you have this kind of money in the year, and we tell them, okay, we have these disasters, can we go? And they approve with the board, and they told us, okay, you cannot use the funding for this disaster, but they have our due diligence, they know how CADENA works. We have made pre-arrangements of what information they need, what they need to send to the board for the approval. And then in the time that the disaster comes, or that we are mapping a disaster, we send all the information. Like with hurricanes in the United States, we have the forecast 3 or 4 days before the hurricane stroke. So we can see okay, this will come. If this will come, this can be our response. We will need this money. Are you approving this? If they say yes, we are ready to deploy, and we have the money in our account. So it's easier to go to the disaster and not to have the worrying of, okay, can we go? Can we help? What we can do? And this type of funding has helped us to deploy quickly. We are in the disasters, they strike, and we are 20 or 48 hours after the disaster stroke there. So this is very incredible for us, because we can see the needs, we can talk to the people, and we can coordinate with the other NGOs and with the government. But the time is gold in the disaster, because many people can die in this time. We have a rescue team, so for them these hours are very, very important to rescue people alive and not bodies.
Yeah, thank you so much, RAQUEL. Yeah, I think that really, to me, as we discussed that earlier, kind of underlined this idea that for companies in particular with resources that are kind of earmarked for disaster response, having that existing relationship with an organization, and again, thinking back to this community-oriented approach to an organization that can support response in communities of interest, is really, really important, because as you said, that time factor is so critical. And when something happens, if you don't already have that relationship, then you won't be able to get the resources in time to be able to deploy or to use them in deployment. So, and I think sorry.
Yes, if I can add something, for us it's very important that the people in the company knows about the disasters, know how to react, and that they have a plan for their own people. Because if you are damaged by a disaster, or your people is damaged by a disaster, you have to react. So you have to have some mechanisms or policies inside the organization, and also the training, like how you can react, how can HR react to this. So we work with the companies that we have these funds, so they can have the whole disaster things inside, because for us it's also important that they are safe and the people is safe. So we have developed this because CADENA has like one of our pillars is the educational part, so that you know everything about disasters, crisis, and how you can do it.
Great. Yeah, I think that's really important as well, and speaks to one of the question earlier around assisting employees, not only providing them with assistance, but having a plan for, you know, if they themselves are impacted. So awesome. Is there anything else that you would want to share about kind of the current work of CADENA and how you've been able to support some of these?
No, so I will invite you to see the work of CADENA. You can join our social media. We have an office in the US in Florida. You can see at CADENA Foundation or cadena.ngo. You can also contact me, and we will be happy to work with any of you.
Great. Thank you so much, Raquel. I'm looking at our time, and I'm going to quickly wrap us up with our last section. So I really appreciate that that story, and I think that for everyone listening, it's a really good example. And you know, we work with thousands of organizations around the world, and I think CADENA has been a really good example for us of an organization that is thinking ahead, which is one of the reasons why we're so happy to have Raquel join us today, to think about not only how do we deploy those resources, but truly how do we make sure that the organization is resilient to the needs that are spiking. So thinking back to that needs model and the problem statement, being able to have the resources ready to scale is really important here. So thinking about from the funder's perspective, how we can be working with organizations like CADENA and with leaders like Raquel in this, there's a few different ways in which we as funders can be involved. So mapping this a bit from that cluster model, which you know laid out the different actions that are involved in humanitarian response and adaptation to humanitarian emergencies, and thinking about what funders and grant makers, and in this case companies, can do to make the system better and to make the response more meaningful and impactful. There's four things that I just want to highlight. The first is investing in resilience, and we're thinking about resilience of organizations. Resilience in the sense of scalability, in flexibility, potentially also in relationships with other funders, connections within the communities, understanding what type of other relationships that they would need to succeed in the form of either monetary contribution or employee time, if that's something that's also on the table for your responsibility and philanthropy programs. The best time to do this is when there is a minimum amount of response happening, because that's when you'll have much more resource and attention being focused on what's next. So making these investments, as Raquel said when she was sharing a bit about the work that they do, $1 invested in resilience and in preparation can avoid $17 needed to scale that response later. So in terms of how to deploy limited budgets most effectively, this stage is really important. When we're looking at direct response, and let's say the first few days after a disaster hits, again, if you're starting the conversation after the disaster happens, you're too late. What we recommend is that you move into a listening stance, to listen to leaders like Raquel and organizations like CADENA to say what they need. And if you're committed to their work, you know that you should be able to respond to those needs as best you can. And in that sense, it's really, they are the experts here. We want to make sure that the experts have the resources they need. And then after that initial response period, I think a really interesting statistic here that shouldn't be a surprise, but is also always shocking to me when I see it, is that 1/3 of all disaster funding, this includes not just philanthropy and philanthropic dollars, but also government spending, is given or designated within the first 4 weeks following a disaster, which means that a disaster like the earthquake in Turkey received 1/3 of all of the funding that it is going to get within a month of that happening. Now, we know that that whole region had significant structural damage, there is definitely ongoing need there, and there's going to be a lot more need for funding. What the people impacted by that disaster and too many others see is that the attention of the global philanthropic sector and the global funding sector focuses very keenly on a specific topic and issue, but then moves on very quickly. For funders looking to commit to communities, potentially communities where employees are present, thinking about what happens after that immediate response is really, really important. And then finally, looking at the ongoing needs in bringing the community back to a normal state, investments in infrastructure, investments in reconstruction and rebuilding are also much needed. And in countries where there's not a strong insurance program or insurance industry is not going to be something that we can really take for granted. So putting these all together, I want to be clear that it's not as if you don't do one of these or if you don't do a few of these that you are a quote unquote bad or ineffective funder. But these are all levers that we can pull on to start to make an impact and make a difference. And then in terms of how CAF America is supporting this process, and really at the core of the work that we're doing right now is a new program that we launched actually in September this year, which is called our Global Relief Navigator. And this is a tool that you can find online at relief.cafamerica.org. But what we're committed to doing for any donors here in the US is pre-vetting local partners like CADENA, going through that due diligence process that would otherwise delay funding up front to make sure that there are trusted partners that have been fully passed through an onboarding process and adding them to a database that any donor can access. We are making that database available through this relief.cafamerica.org website in the form of an interactive map, and you can see a screenshot of that here on the screen. We are actively tracking emergencies, humanitarian emergencies, disasters, and crises around the world. And we are adding them to this interactive map. Clicking into each of those, you can see the organizations that we have vetted that are responding to those disasters and crises. CADENA, if you visit, you can see CADENA is listed on many of the emergencies that we're tracking. And one of the great reasons we love working with RAQUEL and her team. And anyone here in the US who wants to give can support those organizations through a gift to CAF America. We facilitate funding to all those organizations. Again, they are pre-approved by us. So for example, if you wanted to work with CADENA in a specific crisis, instead of having to go through your own separate onboarding to them, you can make a gift to us. We can make a gift to them. And they would know that support is coming in within a few days of receiving the gift. So it's a very strong platform for disaster response grant making, humanitarian relief grant making, and we're really excited to be able to partner with organizations like CADENA, and at this point, I think over 300 organizations in locally registered in countries all over the world to be able to provide this lens through which to see the opportunities available to corporate philanthropy. So I'm actually at the end of the deck now, and so I'm going to move over to Q&A. If you want to put questions on anything that we've talked about into the Q&A function, we'll be able to facilitate those at this point. And Jeff, I can see you jumping back in. I might hand it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Brooks. Really interesting conversation. While we're waiting for other questions to pop in, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about when you said it has passed your vetting and due diligence with the dots on the map, knowing the risk factors that companies have to think about when they're making grants to different parts of the world from a compliance point of view. Could you elaborate on that just to make me feel good about clicking on one of those dots?
Yeah, definitely. So when we look at granting to any international organization, when I say international organization, I mean any organization that is incorporated in a country that's not the US and is not a 501c3. We have to look at two things. The first is, are they doing charitable work and are they a charity, right? So we are a public charity ourselves. and we're commonly getting grants that require a receipt that allows a donor to either say that the grant is exempt or to claim a deduction. So we're doing a deep dive into the organization's governance to understand how it's run and to make sure that that work is charitable. On the other side, we have to look at things that would be applied to any financial transaction and any risks that are applied to sending money overseas. And we're sending hundreds of millions of dollars to hundreds of countries every year. So we are very good at understanding what about an organization would make that risky to us, and then looking at things like governing documents, audited financial statements, doing background checks on the senior staff and the board of directors, and really doing a top to bottom review of the risk matrix of that organization to say, yes, this is someone we can trust, and yes, this is a legitimate organization that can handle the grants that we're sending them. And so we can, by having them on the map, we can say that we've done all of those checks and that they're working with us in a capacity that we've defined their ability to do the response work that they say they're doing, and that they have the resources to carry that out as well.
Good. Okay. Thank you. I will be able to sleep better at night knowing that answer. There's a question in the chat from a participant who is based in Uganda. And to change the question a little bit, is there a way that an NGO located somewhere around the world could actually apply to be one of the dots on the map?
Yes. First of all, thank you to whoever's joining from Uganda. It's great to have you. Yes. So if you go to our Global Relief Navigator website at relief@cafamerica.org, there's information about how charities in any way would be able to be added to the platform. We do, thankfully, have funding to support the work that we're doing to build partnerships with charities. So there is no additional cost or any sort of fee associated with being added here. All that you have to do is fill out a short eligibility application, say what type of work you're doing that you think would be relevant to the Relief Navigator, and then our team will take that, review all the information, review all of the documents that are submitted, and then sign a grant agreement with you to just ensure that the money that we're sending is going towards the purposes that you say it is. That it's a fairly simple process right now. That's taking under 2 weeks for us, and for charities would be completely free of charge for disaster response purposes.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Raquel, I have a question I thought for you, and it also ties in to the polling questions. And I think I'm pretty up on global disasters, and I didn't get 100% on your quizzes that we're taking. And I thought, okay, well, I need to pay more attention. But at the end of the day, a lot's going on in the world all the time. And that's why I think that we rely on an organization, like CAF America and CADENA. And, Raquel, when you said that a couple of days, or actually it was last week, when we were, preparing for this webcast, that you were right in the middle of what was happening in Valencia. I think that was a more high-profile disaster, but I will admit that living in Southern California, I bet if I walked up and down my street in my neighborhood and talk about the horrendous flooding in Valencia, they would think of Valencia, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. I'm thinking, oh, I didn't hear about flooding there. So, is this global world that is complex. And one of the things that we in corporate philanthropy and CSR are always conflicted with is, where do we respond and when do we respond, oftentimes based on who our company is, where our our employees are located, our operations are located, our customers are located. And Brooks, going back to that slide, the one that you showed that was primarily Middle East, North Africa, a lot of the dots on there are areas that a lot of our companies that are on today don't operate in. So how do you all think about, one, raising the awareness to people who might not be aware that, you know, certain things are happening in places of the world, and then where the companies that you work with to help them on their funding reconcile that where it might make sense to invest their limited resources versus where the greatest need is.
Okay, so first of all, it's completely normal for us. It happens to me also. Like, I go to dinner with my friends and they say like, okay, is there a flooding in Brazil? Why are you going to Brazil? So we are like mapping all the disasters all the time with, first of all, with the news, with the disasters web that we have many of them, but also with people and partners in the ground. And each time the humanitarian aid is locally led. If you had people in the ground, you have people in different places and allies, it's easier to respond. And how we do it with our donors, we send to them newsletters. So we continue to get them informed all the time, what is happening, what news are we hearing. So we send them information depending on the donor, how they love to receive the information, so they can know what is happening and how we can do these investments. And also through partners like CAF America, we see like, okay, we write to them and we say like, this is happening, how we can react. And we think that this platform will be very, very useful for CADENA.
Perfect. Brooks, you've got 1 minute.
Great. Yeah, I think that this balance of, where to focus and thinking about where employees are versus where need is a really important and really a very valid tension for corporate grant makers. And I would say that it's completely fair to say that it's more important to focus on communities where the employees are, because that's where the company is going to see the most impact there. We see companies that have done that still have money to give. And it's not that every company is in this capacity or has this ability, right? But thinking about expanding that globally, I do think that we get into an equity conversation. And while I don't think, again, it's unfair to focus where employees are, if you have a large budget and you're only focusing on the US and you're a global company, I think, and that's an extreme case, but thinking about places where maybe a $5,000 grant could make $100,000 of benefit, I think that there's a values and equity conversation to be had there that I don't want to go too much further into now. And it's totally fine not to have it, but there are very, I think, easy next steps to get into in terms of making the case for doing that intentionally.
Well, I think that could be a conversation for our next webcast. So, Brooks, Raquel, want to thank you both. This has been a great conversation. Raquel, great to talk about the clusters of response and how you approach your work. Brooks, very excited. I'm anxious to get into the tool and start clicking on these different places all around the world. So I want to thank you both for an important conversation today. I want to thank CAF America for being a sponsor of this work. We do have some upcoming webcasts that are on the screen for you. One on November 12th on Are You Embracing the New Landscape of Total Rewards? And December 10th, Why Diversity, Inclusion, Equity Matters to Your Workers. So we have that coming up, but look to the Conference Board website for all sorts of information all the time and insights for what's ahead and what you need to know to both help you, help your company, and help society be more effective. So with that, I want to thank you all for participating today, and be well.